ask for 14 months, which is essentially time served. But when probation came in with that assessment, which was 60 months to 72 months, clearly the judge took that into consideration. Now, he downwardly departed from that, meaning I think two things are to note here that you heard the judge say there. One is that a sentence should be sufficient but not greater than necessary to achieve the ends of justice. And so you'll often hear defense attorneys saying that. The second is that similarly situated defendants, you want no discrepancies in similarly situated defendants. When you look at all of the Mann Act guilty verdicts sort of in this jurisdiction, this is a pretty high sentence. And so I think the judge didn't want to get out of that heartland of the sentences while taking into account the violence here. That's the biggest issue here.
Well, right. So on the one hand, you're saying Joe Schmo comes in, has a Mann Act violation. You want the sentences to be the same to hold up that important judicial principle that all people are. On the other hand, the judge, as Jerika went on at some length about all of this other material and all of the stuff the judge mentioned. Is that a part of the Mann Act charge, or is that...
Interesting. So it's not. So remember, it was a huge win for his defense when he was acquitted of those sex trafficking charge, which is essentially a Mann Act charge with the element of violence. And the defense actually raised a constitutional argument here in their brief, saying that, look, if you consider that conduct, the violence, the coercion that was presented by the prosecution, that's actually going against what the sentencing guidelines recommend or state, that you can't consider acquitted conduct. Essentially, he was found not guilty of that conduct, so why consider it in the sentence? The judge setting some precedent here, saying, absolutely, I can consider the evidence that was produced at trial. It's not necessarily going against those acquittals. There was obviously evidence of violence here. You can take into account his character, his demeanor. This has always been a tale of two different Sean Combs. The defense wants to portray him as, a lost man who has trauma issues since his father was murdered at the age of 3, with addiction issues, struggling to get by. The prosecution paints him as sort of a nefarious, devious, really serial perpetrator of violence.
So in the end here, you mentioned that the defense team will be happy with this verdict.
Oh, well, look, I mean, they wanted him to walk out. I think Agnifilo said, today we want to walk out. I think they may appeal on the constitutional grounds, on the grounds that they're going to say that the judge took into account this acquitted conduct and that they should only be looking at the actual violations of the Mann Act.
So just to catch people up with that, so if it comes out in trial that you did X, Y, and Z, but you are then acquitted of the charges in which that information came out, the defense's argument will be the judge can't take that into consideration.
Exactly.
Even though it was talked about and everybody knows about it, can't do it. That would be their grounds.
Exactly, because you weren't found guilty of that offense. They haven't proven it by beyond a reasonable doubt. However, forever, sentencing judges can take into account prior bad acts if they find by a preponderance of the evidence that those were committed. And so it's kind of a gray area there. But clearly this judge did take those factors into account to some degree, but then mitigated it as well to keep it within those, to keep things a little bit more consistent in terms of, similarly situated defendants.
All right, Caroline Polisi, thank you. CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman was inside the overflow courtroom as the sentencing was read and is now outside for us. Katrina, what did you make? What's your reaction? What did you witness?
I mean, what was striking when the sentence was finally read is how still Sean Combs was. He just sat there, his hands clasped, looking down, and it was such a contrast to earlier because I would say it was such an emotional day in that courtroom. When Sean Combs' kids spoke in court today, they were all crying. His lawyer, Nicole Westmoreland, was crying. Sean Combs got up there and said his own words, and his voice was really shaking. He was very emotional as he told the judge how this had affected his life, how he felt like a changed man. And even when the judge read this sentence, he began by praising Sean Combs, by talking about the work that he's done, the barriers that he's broken, how impressive it is, even at a young age, having lost his father, all that he overcome. But he said that all of that could not wash away the record of this case, the evidence that we saw in that courtroom. He also pointed to the fact that some of this aggravating behavior, the violence, took place even after Combs already knew that he was being investigated. And after that Intercontinental video that we've seen so many times, Sean Combs posted this apology on Instagram. The judge said, saying a lot of what he said in the courtroom today, and yet even after that, he beat one of the women who testified in this trial. So the judge was just not convinced that his behavior had changed, and he said that this had to be done for deterrence. And Sean Combs just really sat there looking defeated. He told us in court today that he was broken. He looked absolutely distraught when his kids were speaking earlier. He was crying. He was wiping his face with a tissue. And you can see really how all of this has affected him. And now he is going to have to deal with this incarceration.
And in the judge's remarks, you mentioned that, Katrina, that he started off and he sort of had a trail of the way he. How long did he speak for? And was he pretty much monotone the whole way, or did the judge betray any emotion in his remarks?
No, I would say that there absolutely was, and I can't say how long because he was actually still speaking as I left the courtroom. He was praising the women who came and testified in this trial and the courage that it took for them to do that as I walked out. But you could absolutely hear emotion in his voice when he was talking about all of the things that Sean Combs has accomplished. You could tell that, you know, he is very impressed by all that he has done, by the work that he is continuing to try to do in the prison system. But all of that just was not enough to overcome the massive amount of evidence that he said we saw in this case, the violence, the extreme nature of the behavior, the length of this behavior. It happened over a decade with multiple victims, and all of that just was not enough to supersede him saying that he now feels remorseful for this, that he is repentant. And earlier in the day, the judge also said that he just wasn't fully convinced by the narrative that Sean Combs and his team have been saying.
CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman, thank you. We want to go back to Jerika Duncan, who's outside the courthouse. Jerika, there are always in these high-profile trials people who gather around, who kind of come and pick sides. What has the reaction been in the wake of this sentencing?
I think you have people that have been out here, some that support Combs and are saying things like free Diddy, and then you have folks who are advocates and wanted to see him face some serious time. An attorney that I did speak to did make clear, though, that a lot of times in these federal cases, people don't necessarily serve the entire time. So again, Combs has already been behind bars for a little over a year. Then there's, I was told, 15% off for good behavior, sometimes 15% off the sentence. There's First Step Act credits to consider. There's a certain percentage that you can do for halfway house or home confinement, and possibly additional time off for drug treatment programs. So in the end, we don't know exactly what that really looks like in terms of how much more time Combs will spend behind bars. But again, this judge trying to send a message saying that what he did was wrong and that he did believe the credibility of those women who testified. Court just adjourned, but I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts from the judge. He looks over at Combs and says, you are going to get through this. There is light at the end to help people like him. You will have a chance, he says, to show your children and the world that accountability and change is possible.
Jerika Duncan from outside the courthouse, Jerika, thank you so much.